Hello. Yesterday we held an interfaith poetry sharing event in the town I live in, where people from different religious backgrounds, myself included, so pagans, Jews, Sikhs, Hindus and so forth, came together and shared poetry from within their tradition. Some of them shared poetry by well-known, at least within their communities, well-known poets, and one person brought long poems and songs which he had written himself, which were really good actually. And then part of it was to recite the poem and then also explain it a little bit, set the context, give people from outside that community an understanding of what the poem was about. And I had mentioned this prior to the event on Facebook to see if anyone could recommend some poetry alongside the ones I had in mind. And various people did make recommendations, and some also said that they'd like to know which ones were eventually chosen, and sort of interest in poetry in general. So I'm going to read to you the poems that I read on behalf of the pagan community at the event yesterday. I will give you all of the ones I did read, plus I had a couple of spare backups just in case not many people turned up, and I needed some additional poetry. As it was, there was plenty of poetry to fill the time going, so I didn't read all of the poems I had on my list of poetry. So I'll give you those poems as well, because I think they're good poems, and it did lead to not only just poem, but it led to quite a bit of discussion around issues like, for example, what makes a pagan poem or a Jewish poem or a Hindu poem pagan or Jewish or Hindu? Is it the religious identity of the person who writes the poem, or is it the subject matter of the poem, or maybe a bit of both? Because you could get somebody who is not Jewish writing a poetry about Jewish stories, Jewish imagery, Jewish ritual. Would that still constitute a Jewish poem, even though the person writing it is from outside of that faith? That is a point, particularly with the first one I'm going to read, which I think I have recorded at some point in the past. I'm going to read it again anyway, if I have, because this is a poem by Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde, certainly towards the end of his life, became a very devout Christian, and if you read something like the Ballad of Reading Gaol, it's replete with Christian imagery and theology. But he was also, from a young man onwards, from being a student onwards, deeply in love with the classical myths, with Greek myth, Roman myth and so forth, and numerous of his poems are steeped in the mythology of the ancient world. And there's clearly a real love for it. I'm not suggesting for one that he was off worshipping the ancient Greek gods. So far as I know, he never did anything like that. But it clearly stirred him and moved his heart. So even though he is presumably was not a pagan, nonetheless he was somebody who could write very much within the pagan milieu and create this very evocative, and in fact I'd say most of his poetry is a damn sight better than an awful lot of poetry written by people who are officially practicing pagans. So this is Pan, the name of the poem, and it's an invocation both of the ancient Greek god himself, but not just a wallowing in the stories of the past. It's thinking as a man of his modern period, what that modern period was missing, and what he clearly in this poem thinks is missing, is the joyfulness, the love of nature, the sense of freedom, the magic, the mystery, the wonderment of Pan himself, and by extension, of course, the other deities of the ancient world. So this is a rather nostalgic poem, a dream of a place that used to be, a time that used to be, an era that used to be. And I could wax a bit more lyrical on why I think he felt that, but I'll just read the poem. Pan. O goat-foot god of Arcady, this modern world is grey and old, and what remains to us of thee? No more the shepherd lads in glee throw apples at thy wattled fold, O goat-foot god of Arcady. Not through the laurels can one see thy soft brown limbs, thy beard of gold, and what remains to us of thee? and dull and dead our Thames would be, for here the winds are chill and cold. O goat-foot god of Arcady, then keep the tomb of Hellas, thine olive woods, thy vine-clad wold, and what remains to us of thee? Though many an unsung elegy sleeps in the reeds our rivers hold, O goat-foot god of Arcady, oh, what remains to us of thee? Oh, leave the hills of Arcady, thy satyrs and their wanton play. This modern world hath need of thee. No nymph or faun indeed have we, for faun and nymph are old and grey. Oh, leave the hills of Arcady. This is the land where liberty lit grave-browed Milton on his way. This modern world hath need of thee. A land of ancient chivalry where gentle Sydney saw the day. Oh, leave the hills of Arcady. This fierce sea lion of the sea, this England lacks some stronger lay. This modern world hath need of thee. Then blow some trumpet loud and free, and give thine oaten pipe away. Oh, leave the hills of Arcady. This modern world has need of thee. It does indeed. We'll come back to that one. I also read a poem by Hilary Llewelly-Williams, which I've definitely recorded before for other things, because it's a favourite poem of mine. To the best of my knowledge, Hilary Llewelly-Williams is not pagan, but she is clearly very inspired by the mythology and the landscape and the folklore and legends of Wales, and possibly other places too, of course, outside of Wales. And this one is a very modern poem. It doesn't have all the sort of the ancient classical tropes that the Oscar Wilde poem has. It refers to lots of modern scientific notions in here. But it is that fusion of shall we say, science and magic, that fusion of landscape and body, which you also find in other poetry by other writers that I much admire, like the Sharkey, which maybe this is a bit of a Celtic thing going on here, a Welsh poet and Irish poet. They're both recounting similar themes of that fusion of the human with the non-human, and I think that is particularly pagan in many senses. And just to explain a bit of, I just said a few seconds ago about the fusion of science and magic, why I think that's important is because if we look at the history of science, most of the modern day scientific movements began their roots in ancient pagan times. Astronomy came from astrology, chemistry came from alchemy. Whilst the ancient practices are sometimes ridiculed by people like Richard Dawkins and so on as being mumbo jumbo and claptrap, he wouldn't have most of his modern science if it wasn't for that mumbo jumbo and claptrap that he looks down his nose at. Once upon a time, scientific knowledge, magic, mysticism, spirituality were one and the same. They were fused together, and they may well become one and the same again in some point in the distant future, because it's all about understanding life. It's all about understanding the universe and how the universe works, whether you're approaching it from a more sort of poetic, romantic point of view, or whether you're approaching it from a more mechanistic, scientific point of view. There is immense wonder and beauty and magic to be had there, and that's something that various people in the 20th century noted, even amongst those who were pushing a very hard-lined atheist agenda. You had people like Carl Sagan, who fully understood the wonder and beauty and transcendence of the cosmos, even if he felt a lot of religion was, probably most religion, was codswallop. So this one, anyway, get back to the poem, is called Changeling. The marriage of wood and water spawned this creature. Wood chromosomes and water chromosomes juggled together, shaping a wizened femur as if old ivy woman tossed her leg bone to the elements and the waves took it to scour the moss and the dirt away, then rolled it back to the shore. There are faces in it, gargoyles, gurnings, the grin of a running dog, an ivy dog running from tree to tree, a sea dog cocking its leg at the suck slick of the tide that whittled it by the push and pull of the moon. Wood and water and the lunar carver conjuring a fake, a changeling brat, a beglamoured stock outwardly whole but inwardly skewed like this. I'd love to see the rest of the skeleton, the ribcage opening, its shrivelled petals, the pelvis writhing in exuberant loops, the skull. What would they make of the skull? The one true giveaway that careful smoothing of flesh cannot disguise. And of course it was, by the eyes you knew them, inhuman. The goblin urge to recreate, to play with blocks of DNA, to make believe, and we're part of the game. So an ivy stem can mimic a thigh bone, and our veins went out like a tree with the sea moving in rhythm through us, casting us back, along with other flotsam wood bombs and shells in the tidal reaches. And who comes combing the beaches for what remains of us? Which I think that last line, with some the pagan Feast of the Dead, well, for some pagans don't know, Feast of the Dead just around the corner, it is particularly pertinent. The notion that we must all be conscious, whether we're young or middle-aged or old or whatever we are, we must all be conscious that at some point in the future we will be dead. And we will leave a legacy behind us, and that legacy may be financial, it may be cultural, books, paintings, art. It may be an emotional legacy of the people who loved us, or possibly even the people who hated the sight of us. It may be an intellectual legacy of things we've discovered and invented and researched. It may be all manner of legacies, and of course, pretty much every single one of us will leave a legacy of a body. Some people will be cremated, of course, certain will be ashes. But even with cremation, the body still has to be dealt with by the survivors. And so that becomes pertinent as to what we leave behind and who is going to be finding us. In a quite literal sense, who's going to find our bodies when we're both killed over? Who's going to deal with those bodies afterwards? Family, friends, if we've got nobody at all, the state. And what will they make of us? What will they make of what's left of us? That's a point to bear in mind. Now, one of the poems I didn't get the time to read, because I say there was a good turnout of people with poetry, is by Shelley, Percy Shelley. And it's called The Hymn of Pan. You might notice a bit of a theme going on here. Shelley, in a letter to a fellow writer, a chap called Hogg, talks of them sharing faith in the old gods and sharing faith in Pan, and himself building a turf altar to Pan. And this does lead to some debate in literary circles, historical circles. Were the romantic poets who revived so much of the passion and interest for classical Greece and Rome, and eventually that led to an interest in ancient Egypt and many other things, were they genuine full-on pagans in the way that we might understand the people of the ancient world as having been? So when he talks of building an altar to Pan, does he literally mean he built an altar, he went and prayed to Pan and believed Pan existed and made his offerings to Pan? Or were they all just posh, upper-class chaps indulging in a bit of whimsy, and yes, maybe they occasionally put on a toga and pranced around and swigged a bit of wine, but it was all more play acting than actual, intense, genuine, passionate belief? Of course, the answer is we'll probably never know. Without the benefit of a TARDIS to nip back and find out, we're unlikely to know whether, when they talk of building altars, whether they were being whimsical or whether they were being quite upfront and straightforward, and this is actually what they did. I'm going to choose to believe the latter, because I like the idea that there were these people in centuries past so moved by the old stories they were hearing that they felt something within those stories. It touched their hearts and moved them and inspired them, and they responded. Because that's what's happened to me, and quite a lot, loads of people that I know these days who have the same experience. But anyway, the hymn of Pan. From the forests and highlands we come, from the river-girt islands where loud waves are dumb, listening to my sweet pipings, the wind in the reeds and the rushes, the bees on the bells of times, the birds on the myrtle bushes, the cicale above in the lime and the lizards below in the grass, were as silent as ever old Molus was, listening to my sweet pipings. Liquid Peneus was flowing, and all dark Tempe lay in Balian shadow growing, the light of the dying day. Speeded by my sweet pipings, the Silene and Sylvans and Fawns, and the nymphs of the woods and the waves to the edges of the moist river lawns, and the brink of the dewy caves, and all that did then attend and follow were silent with love, as you now, Apollo, with envy of my sweet pipings. I sang of the dancing stars, I sang of the daedal earth, and of heaven and the giant wars, and love, and death, and birth. And then I changed my pipings, singing how down the vale of Menelaus I pursued a maiden and clasped a reed. Gods and men, we are all deluded thus. It breaks in our bosom, and then we bleed. All wept, as I think both ye now would, if envy or age had not frozen your blood at the sorrow of my sweet pipings. It's inspired, as I should have said this first, it's inspired by the story of the contest between Apollo and Pan to see who was the greater musician. And Pan played his pipes, his panpipes, the strings, and Apollo had his lyre, his harp, that he played upon. And spoiler, Apollo won the contest, but Pan created music for the ages. And you can see that story as a little bit of a reflection of the kind of social class structure of ancient Greece. Apollo, that very upright classical god, that god of the upper classes, of the educated Athenians, of the music of the royal courts, or of the aristocratic circles that the wealthy moved in, and rustic Pan, the god of the working peasant, the god of the rural people rather than the city dwellers, god of the shepherds and shepherdesses, the people with calloused hands and no silk cushions and soft cushions and couches to lay upon, but whose music stirs the heart, is primeval. And of course it's also a reminder of that other story from a later period of a sailor who rounds the horn and hears a great voice calling out, and it's supposed to mark the era in which Christ was born and the pagan gods therefore supposedly died. A great voice calls out in lamentation and sorrow, "The great god Pan is dead." And that's meant to mark, in early Christian tradition, meant to mark the end of the classical world, the end of the polytheist era, the end of the old ways and the old gods. Of course, they're still here. I read one of my own poems because, of course, I'm vain, and why not? The one I chose to read, I don't think I have recorded before, and I chose this one out of vanity, and not simply the vanity that I wrote it, but an added level of vanity, in that quite a few years ago, I forget when exactly, but going back quite a few years, I was doing some research into Irish poetry on the net, and I chanced upon a website talking about female poetry, and one of the poems listed was mine, which very flatteringly the person who wrote the website had attributed to being late 17th, early 18th century Fenian poem by an unknown author. So I pinged him an email saying, "Excuse me," and we had quite a funny little chat. And he so by all means keep the poem up there, because I'm quite flattered that you like it. But obviously put my name on it and point out it isn't quite as old as sometimes I feel personally. So the poem is called Bon and Chron, which is a Gaelic saying, phrase, meaning neither collar nor crown. Collar as in the priest's dog collar, but it also has the euphemism of dog collar as in woof woof woof, dog collar, because the dog is in service to the human. And it echoes partly to the old parables and folk tales in which a dog and a wolf meet, and the dog talks about its life of comfort around the fire, being regularly fed and sleeping on the sofas, and the wolf says, "Well, I often go hungry and I risk all sorts of dangers, but I am free, and you are in service to these lazy, useless humans with their capriciousness and their cruelty and the rest of it." And it's that comparison, that contrast between the life of the domesticated dog and the life of the wild wolf. The crown here being the crown of the king, and obviously from a Fenian point of view, that's the English monarchy. But you could equally argue any other monarchy, that this is a tale of, or poem, or rather comparing the life of the wild wolf to the lives of those who are in service to others, whether that's in service to the dominion of the Catholic Church of the day, or to a monarch, and by extension, of course, to a parliament of corrupt, bigoted and tyrannical politicians. I'm sure once every blue moon we get a decent politician, but there's an awful lot of dreadful ones over the centuries. So anyway, this is the poem that I read out. Born on Neither your collar nor crown shall I wear, my nose not brown, nor I some clown in your court, and chains brought, a wolf to town. By no oath bound to your king, to my gods alone I sing, grey shadow hiding from sight, to keep the right from waning. In red gold you dress these slaves, what throne can forget 9 waves? In deep caves our flame I shield, never to yield to such knaves. Collars serve to rein dogs in, quell their nerve with shades and sin. Wild wolves kin such wrangles scorn. Free-born I stay, son of Finn. My brothers hunted, slain, skinned, yet still my cries ride the wind. Numbers thinned, but still we wait. For your hate we have not sinned. Now the lone hunters take heed. Upon the great stag we feed, blood for mead. His death, our life, ends this strife, stirs this dried seed. The old packs come together, ties that fear cannot sever. Endeavour in pride to stand in the wolfland forever. Island used to be, centuries ago, frequently referred to as the Wolfland. Even Shakespeare refers to it as the Wolfland, because of the large number of wolves that were meant to live in Ireland back before they were all hunted to extinction. And the wolf, of course, within Celtic lore and Anglo-Saxon traditions and a number of other traditions, is often regarded as emblematic of the outlaw, the social outcast, going back to the days when various monarchs and princes and emperors and what have you put prize money on the head of a dead wolf, literally, for hunters to bring in the severed head of a dead wolf, chuck it on the floor, and they'd get so much money per dead wolf. When the chief form of agriculture was livestock, particularly sheep, and in some parts of the goats, which wolves will predate upon when they're desperately hungry. In wintertime they'll come down and risk the wrath of humanity by predating upon their livestock. So the wolf became seen as an enemy, and partly, of course, there is all that agricultural imagery of the shepherd and the sheep within Christianity, which has, perhaps not surprisingly, for people who place so much emphasis on agrarian imagery, taken to seeing the wolf as emblematic of the devil. Not always, because you do have stories like Brother Wolf and St. Francis, but a lot of Christian imagery tends to link the wolf to predatory, demonic, unholy forces, rather than as an emblem of wildness and freedom and spirit and that sort of nobility that at least some pagan traditions have attributed to the wolf. Is a bit of a mixed bag, even within pagan traditions, in that some cultures have seen it as rather a frightening image of the wild, savage beast, and others have seen it as an range of nobility. That's what the nobility was what I was going for in that point. The last poem I'll do here, we ran out of time to do, and this is a modern work by Tom Hirons called The Worship of Place, which blends lots of interfaith type imagery from different religious traditions together, but with a pagan substructure to it. And I'm not sure whether this would have gone down well or badly had I had the time to read it, in that some of the other religions there might have found the imagery inspirational, and some of them might have found it possibly a bit presumptive, in that it's attributing sacred imagery from within paganism to non-pagan religion. So I can see people reacting in either way to this one, if it's read to a religiously diverse audience. But the worship of place. There is a temple I know whose roof is made of sky. On its ceiling are painted clouds and stars, and the rooms and corridors are made of leaves and branches. Its doors are open to all people, day and night. Anyone may enter, whether or not they listen to the wise words spoken within. I know a synagogue through which a river flows against boulders inscribed with scriptures of moss, where salmon leap in exultation and wild doves sing. The rabbi has a beard of green-grey lichen, and his prayers are carried on the gurgling silver stream. I know a mosque in which every direction is sacred within that holy place. I see the face of the beloved beneath every stone and in the heart of every flower. Fallen oak leaves are the flurries of the faithful dancing. The call to prayer is sung upon the whirling wild wind. The priestess of this shrine bars entry to no one. She greets me in silence, and in silence I depart. Everyone is welcomed in for worship. The congregation of all creatures give praise and offerings to the hallowed sanctuary. The object of their veneration is the world itself. When I arrive in this boundless cathedral, with my eyes unclouded by guile or cunning, I know the presence of such exquisite beauty, and a joy so intense it's almost unbearable. I fall over myself trying to find the best way to worship. I press my back against the trunk of a broad tree, or a tower of cracked, stacked stones. I tell my confession to the twisted heather, and bow down before the yellow-flowered gorse. I renew my vows in the presence of the damsel fly, and receive the blessings of the magpie and the wren. All the while skylarks carry my prayers to heaven. At the altar of this great temple there is a fountain, invisible to my eyes. If my worship is wholehearted, I am washed clean of sorrow, and my restless thirst is quenched. Standing in this sublime sanctuary, I am cracked in two, and an old well bubbles in my heart once again. The water is so clear and delicious, I cannot keep it to myself. Will you come with me to that fountain now, and fill your cup of longing from this endless, untamed stream? I think it's a lovely poem, but clearly some people, I suspect, might think it's a bit imposing pagan imagery on things that I don't always have a great admiration for pagan imagery, I can put it like that. But an interesting one nonetheless. And it went really well as an event in that there was a lot of discussion, a lot of sharing of ideas and thoughts and exploration, and we will undoubtedly do another one maybe next year or whatever. But anyone listening to this who is interested in interfaith things, I'd recommend doing something like this in others if you haven't already done so, quite possibly have. But getting people to come together to share their poems and then talk about them afterwards, and it's the talking about them afterwards that often you get the bridges built and people see unexpected similarities and also sometimes unexpected differences, of understanding and interpretation of certain issues. And it all helps with, I think, spreading a little bit of peace in the world. Although there is always that inevitability with interfaith work that the people least likely to spread peace just don't come to interfaith work because they are so convinced of their own self-righteousness that they've got zero interest in listening to any other religion. And they're the ones who maybe need the peace the most. But that's the way of things, isn't it? So I'll leave it there. Thank you.